The evening air carried the faint hum of anticipation. Golden lights draped across the backyard shimmered like stars pulled down to earth, and the aroma of roses mingled with the scent of roasted lamb wafting from the catering tables. At 57, Eleanor felt a swell of pride as she looked around at the scene before her, a setting worthy of 30 years of devotion. She had been meticulous in planning this anniversary party, insisting on details that mattered. The crystal glasses polished until they gleamed, the string quartet rehearsing her favorite pieces, the family portraits displayed as though the walls themselves wanted to testify to her marriage. Eleanor, dressed in a midnight blue gown that hugged her gracefully aging figure, smoothed the fabric at her waist and smiled. For her, tonight was not simply a milestone, it was a triumph. Marriage was rarely an easy road, yet she and Richard had walked it with determination, raising two children, weathering financial hardships, and surviving illnesses that once threatened to undo them. Through all of it, she had believed that love was their anchor. Tonight, she wanted everyone to see that their bond had endured the test of time. Richard, her husband, stood across the lawn, charming guests with his easy laugh and practiced charisma. His silver hair glinted under the lanterns, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time, how he still managed to turn heads. Women admired him, men envied him, but to Eleanor he was simply Richard, the man she had built her life with, the man who had once vowed before God and witnesses to be hers alone. She had trusted that vow for decades, never doubting its truth. And then there was Margaret. Eleanor's best friend since her early 20s, Margaret had been by her side through every chapter of life. They had shared secrets, raised their children alongside one another, and held each other through grief. Tonight, Margaret was radiant in emerald silk, her laughter carrying above the music as she greeted guests. To Eleanor, her presence was more than friendship. It was kinship, the kind of bond that few women were fortunate enough to find. She had often said that Margaret was the sister she never had. As the quartet began to play a soft waltz, Eleanor's daughter approached, hugging her tightly. "You've outdone yourself, Mom," she whispered, pride glowing in her eyes. Eleanor's heart warmed. Yes, this was what it meant to live a good life. To see her family gathered, friends celebrating, love radiating in every corner of the garden. For a moment, she let herself bask in the perfection of it. The speeches began shortly after, with Richard raising his glass first. His words were eloquent, full of admiration for Eleanor, peppered with humor that made the crowd laugh. Eleanor blushed under the attention, her chest swelling with gratitude. When it was her turn, she spoke of endurance, of love grown deeper through trials, and of the unwavering loyalty that had carried them here. Guests dabbed their eyes, couples clasped hands, and the applause was thunderous. Eleanor felt the affirmation of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every compromise. This was her reward, the honor of a marriage that others envied. Later, as the evening settled into music and conversation, Eleanor wandered among the guests. She listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and accepted their compliments about the party. Yet as she glanced at Richard and Margaret laughing together across the lawn, something faint and uninvited stirred in her chest. She brushed it aside as nothing more than nostalgia mixed with exhaustion. After all, who wouldn't be tired after weeks of planning? Still, the image lingered, her husband and her best friend leaning in close, their smiles just a touch too private. Eleanor shook her head, dismissing the thought. Tonight was not a night for doubts. Tonight was for celebrating love, for honoring the life she had built with Richard and the friendship she cherished with Margaret. She raised her glass once more, the golden liquid shimmering under the lights. "To love," she whispered to herself, almost as a prayer. The orchestra swelled, the guests laughed, and the night carried on, wrapping her in the illusion of everything she had ever wanted. But somewhere, hidden beneath the music and the clinking glasses, a quiet fracture had begun to form, one that Eleanor had yet to notice. The night pressed on with warmth and cheer, yet Eleanor found herself noticing the smallest details. Perhaps it was because she had worked so hard to make this evening flawless that even the tiniest imperfection drew her attention. The caterers were late with the second course. One of the lanterns flickered despite the electrician's assurances, and her grandson had already managed to stain his shirt with raspberry punch. But none of these things truly unsettled her. What caught her eye again and again were the small, fleeting exchanges between Richard and Margaret. They weren't overt, not in a way anyone else might notice. A shared smile that lingered too long, a whisper that ended with Margaret's quick glance around the room, Richard's hand brushing against her arm as if by accident. They were movements so slight that Eleanor almost scolded herself for noticing them at all. But when you had been married for 30 years, you learned to read your husband's body language as fluently as a book you'd read 100 times. Something in those gestures spoke of familiarity, an intimacy not meant to exist in that space. Her mind tried to dismiss it. She reminded herself that Margaret had always been comfortable with Richard. They had known each other for decades, and friendship between men and women wasn't unusual. Margaret had been in their lives since before their children were born. She was Aunt Margaret to the kids, a fixture at birthdays, Christmases, and summer barbecues. It wasn't strange for her to share inside jokes with Richard or for them to laugh together. Still, Eleanor could not ignore the undercurrent in their behavior tonight, an energy that made her feel suddenly like a stranger at her own party. As she moved through the crowd, offering polite smiles and thanking guests for coming, her mind dipped back into small memories she had dismissed before. Richard's late nights at the office these past few months, his phone always face down on the table, a habit he never used to have. Margaret suddenly too busy for their usual weekly lunches, claiming she had new commitments she couldn't avoid. Eleanor had laughed it off, even defended them both when her sister once teased, "Are you sure those two aren't keeping secrets from you?" Secrets. The word gnawed at her now. She glanced across the lawn again. Richard was telling a story, animated and full of charm, the way he always was in crowds. Margaret's laughter rang out, melodic and light, but Eleanor noticed her friend's hand lingering on Richard's sleeve a moment too long. When Margaret caught Eleanor's eye, she quickly withdrew, her cheeks flushed, and turned to refill her drink. Eleanor's heart gave a small, involuntary jolt. Had Margaret been embarrassed because she'd been caught in a harmless gesture? Or was it something more? Eleanor's mind wrestled between the two possibilities. She told herself she was tired, overwrought from weeks of planning, but a seed of doubt had been planted, and no amount of rationalizing seemed able to uproot it. Later in the evening, while Eleanor accepted compliments on the decor, she overheard a hushed conversation behind her. Richard's voice, low, deliberate, followed by Margaret's soft reply. She couldn't make out the words, only the cadence, the unmistakable tone of secrecy. When she turned, they were gone, their laughter already mingling with the crowd a few steps away. A sharp pang of loneliness pressed against Eleanor's chest. How absurd, she thought, to feel isolated at her own anniversary party, surrounded by the very people who had witnessed her life unfold. Yet that was exactly what she felt. Alone. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, all of it blurred into background noise as her eyes continued to search for Richard and Margaret. She chastised herself for being paranoid. Stop it, Eleanor. This is your night, your marriage, your best friend. Don't let your imagination ruin what you've built. Still, the unease clung to her like a shadow, following her from one guest to another. By the time the dessert was served, Eleanor's smile had begun to stiffen. The cracks were invisible to everyone else, but to her they were widening. She had once thought her life was as sturdy as the oak tree in their backyard, its roots too deep to be shaken. But tonight, as she watched Richard pour Margaret another glass of wine, she felt for the first time that perhaps even the strongest trees could splinter from within. The night was wearing on, and the garden glowed with a soft golden haze. Lanterns hung low, music floated gently, and conversations rippled through the crowd like streams merging into a river. Yet Eleanor felt no peace. Her smile had become an act, her laughter a performance. Inside, her chest ached with a gnawing uncertainty. She told herself she was being foolish. Richard had never given her a reason to doubt him, and Margaret had been her confidant for over 3 decades. Still, the unease lingered, tightening its grip with every passing hour. When she turned her gaze toward them, she often found Richard and Margaret standing a little too close, voices dropping low, their expressions shifting when they noticed her watching. It happened suddenly, the moment that cracked her carefully maintained facade. Eleanor had stepped away from the crowd, needing a breath of quiet. As she passed through the side hallway that led into the house, she caught voices drifting from the small study near the back. She slowed her pace, at first intending to pass without listening, but the tone of Richard's voice made her stop. "You have to be more careful," he whispered, his words clipped, urgent. Margaret's voice followed, hushed yet trembling. "I know, but she's starting to notice." The rest of the sentence was muffled by movement. Eleanor froze, her stomach twisting. She pressed herself lightly against the wall, straining to hear more. But footsteps soon shuffled, and a burst of laughter followed, as if they had switched masks in an instant. She pulled back just in time to see them emerge from the study, Richard's hand resting briefly on Margaret's elbow before he stepped into the crowd, his smile wide and easy. Margaret's eyes flickered toward Eleanor. Just for a second, but that second carried a weight Eleanor could not deny. Margaret's face flushed, and she quickly veered off toward the dessert table. Eleanor stood still, her pulse hammering in her ears. She told herself she must have misheard, that perhaps it was something innocent, a misunderstanding. Yet the words she's starting to notice looped in her head, their meaning unmistakable. Later that evening, the universe seemed determined to strip away her denial. Richard's phone buzzed on the table while he was across the room speaking with guests. The screen lit up with a preview of a message. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I'll think of tonight when we're together." The name above it, Margaret. Eleanor's throat tightened, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone before pulling back. She wasn't the kind of woman to snoop, wasn't the kind of wife to invade her husband's privacy. Yet the evidence glared at her in luminous letters. Undeniable. Her knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there in front of everyone. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her trembling fingers against the fabric of her gown. No one else had noticed, thank God. She managed to set her face into a practiced smile when Richard returned, slipping the phone into his pocket without even checking the screen. Eleanor wondered if his casualness was a mask, or if he simply didn't care anymore whether she saw. From that moment, every interaction felt charged with double meaning. Margaret's laugh struck Eleanor as nervous rather than joyful. Richard's hand on Eleanor's shoulder during a toast felt like a performance for the crowd rather than affection. Every look, every gesture seemed to pulse with hidden truth. Inside, Eleanor was unraveling. She thought of the years she had spent devoted to her family, the sleepless nights nursing sick children, the sacrifices she had made to support Richard's career, the times she had leaned on Margaret for comfort. And now, on the night meant to celebrate her loyalty, betrayal loomed like a shadow across every candlelit corner of the garden. But Eleanor was no fool, nor was she a woman who would crumble without answers. The doubts and fragments swirling in her mind sharpened into resolve. She would not confront them blindly, nor would she allow herself to be dismissed as paranoid. If the truth was there, she would uncover it. And when she did, Richard and Margaret would have no place to hide. As she lifted her glass during a toast later that evening, her eyes flickered between the two of them. The smile on her lips was warm, practiced, but beneath it burned a quiet determination. Tonight might still belong to illusions, but the spark of suspicion had been lit, and Eleanor intended to follow its flame until it revealed every hidden truth. The clinking of glasses called the guests to attention once more. It was time for the final round of toasts, the moment Eleanor had both dreaded and anticipated. She stood near the head table, her back straight, her gown flowing elegantly as the chatter dwindled. The string quartet softened their playing until only the delicate hum of violins filled the air. Eleanor had rehearsed what she wanted to say, words about love, loyalty, and the endurance of marriage. But now, with Richard's phone buzzing still vivid in her mind, and Margaret's flushed expression burned into her memory, she found herself veering off script. Richard took the stage first, his charm filling the room as easily as wine pouring into a glass. He spoke of Eleanor's grace, her patience, her sacrifices. He told the story of how they had met, college sweethearts, bound by a chance meeting at the library. Laughter and applause followed, as it always did when Richard performed for an audience. Eleanor smiled, but her hands trembled as she held her glass. She knew now that his words were as polished as the silverware on the table, beautiful but masking the tarnish beneath. When her turn came, she rose slowly, every movement deliberate. The room hushed, all eyes turning to her. For a moment, she hesitated, feeling the weight of 30 years press against her chest. Then, with a steady breath, she began. Marriage, she said, her voice clear, isn't just about love. It's about loyalty. It's about honesty. It's about two people standing together, even when life gives them every reason to drift apart. The crowd murmured approvingly, nodding along. Eleanor's gaze swept the room, but her eyes lingered longest on Richard and Margaret. She saw Margaret stiffen slightly, saw Richard avoid her eyes and sip from his glass. The sight fueled her courage. Loyalty, Eleanor repeated, letting the word hang in the air, isn't always easy. Temptations come, secrets lurk in the shadows, and friendships are tested. The atmosphere shifted. Guests leaned forward, sensing the change in tone, though not yet grasping its full meaning. Eleanor let her words settle like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. I stand here tonight, she continued, not just as a wife of 30 years, but as a woman who has learned that true love can only survive when trust is unbroken. When promises are honored, her daughter's hand tightened around her arm, perhaps sensing that her mother's speech had strayed into dangerous territory. But Eleanor pressed on. She wasn't ready to expose everything. Not yet. Tonight was about setting the stage, watching their reactions, measuring the depth of their guilt. When she raised her glass high, her smile was sharp as glass. So let us drink, she declared, to loyalty, to honesty, to the kind of love that withstands every temptation and every secret. The applause was polite, though hesitant. Some guests shifted in their seats, uncertain about the undertones in her words. Richard clapped half-heartedly, his jaw tight, his eyes focused anywhere but on Eleanor. Margaret's face flushed a deep crimson, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin until it tore slightly at the edge. Eleanor sat down slowly, savoring the tension that now simmered beneath the surface of the party. She had not revealed the truth, but she had cracked the facade. She had sent a message, one meant only for Richard and Margaret, and by their reactions, she knew they had understood it clearly. The rest of the evening moved on, but the air had shifted. Laughter seemed forced, conversations stilted. Eleanor noticed her guests exchanging wary glances, as though they sensed something beneath the polished surface of the celebration. She let them wonder. Let Richard squirm. Let Margaret struggle to meet her eyes. For Eleanor, this was the breaking point, not the end, but the beginning of unraveling what had been hidden. Her speech had been both shield and sword, protecting her dignity while striking at the fragile wall Richard and Margaret had built around their secret. As the music swelled again and couples began to dance, Eleanor remained seated, her eyes calm yet burning. The betrayal had not yet been spoken aloud, but it had been named in silence. And Eleanor knew, deep in her bones, that silence would not protect them for long. The party wound on, but the warmth had gone out of it for Eleanor. Guests still laughed, glasses still clinked, and music still played. Yet everything seemed dulled, like a painting fading in the sun. She moved through the crowd gracefully, smiling when expected, offering polite conversation, but inside she was watching, always watching. Richard kept close to the center of attention, a man born for charm. Margaret floated nearby, never too far, never too close. They avoided each other's gaze more than they had earlier, and that in itself told Eleanor something. Their caution had sharpened. Her speech had rattled them, but suspicion was no longer enough for Eleanor. She had lived her life on principles of truth, and now she needed proof. Something undeniable. Something that would silence every doubt and every excuse. The opportunity came quietly. Richard, distracted by an old friend who insisted on telling a long, boisterous story, set his phone down on the table beside him. For years, Eleanor had never cared about his phone. Trust had been the bedrock of their marriage, and privacy had been respected. But tonight, trust lay in ruins, and privacy meant nothing compared to truth. Her hand trembled as she picked it up, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. Her breath caught in her throat as she unlocked it. He hadn't changed the password in years. For a moment, she almost put it back down, almost convinced herself she didn't want to see. But the memory of Margaret's flushed face, the words whispered in the study, and that text glowing on the screen earlier pushed her forward. The messages were there, waiting, thread after thread, words filled with intimacy and longing. I can't stop thinking about last night. She doesn't suspect a thing. You make me feel alive again. Eleanor's eyes blurred with tears as she scrolled, each message cutting deeper than the last. They had been together for months. Long lunches, stolen weekends, secret hotels. All while Margaret still sat in Eleanor's kitchen for coffee, still hugged her children like an aunt, still called her sister. Her stomach twisted violently, bile rising in her throat. She forced herself to breathe quietly, to steady her shaking hands, to set the phone back exactly where it had been. The proof she had sought was now carved into her memory, indelible and cruel. She walked away from the table, the world tilting slightly beneath her feet. She slipped out through the French doors into the darker edge of the garden, where the lanterns did not reach. There, hidden in the shadows, she pressed a hand to her mouth to smother the sob clawing its way out of her chest. 30 years, 30 years of devotion, faith, sacrifice, mocked by the betrayal of the two people she trusted most. But even in the midst of her anguish, a strange clarity began to form. Eleanor had always believed that truth was better than ignorance. Painful as it was, the veil had been lifted. She was no longer doubting, no longer guessing. She knew, and knowledge, she realized, gave her power. When she returned to the glow of the celebration, no one noticed her absence. Guests were busy dancing, servers moving plates, children laughing near the fountain. Richard caught her eye briefly, his smile wide, his laughter rehearsed. Margaret looked away, her cheeks still flushed, her hand tightening around her wineglass. Eleanor's tears had dried. Her face was composed, her back straight. Inside she burned, but she wore her dignity like armor. They thought their secret was safe. They thought she was blind. But Eleanor now held the truth, and with it, the decision of how and when to wield it. She did not speak that night, not yet. Instead, she let the party continue, let Richard play the devoted husband and Margaret the loyal friend. All the while, Eleanor's eyes followed them with the quiet calm of a storm gathering strength. What began as a celebration had become a battleground, though only Eleanor knew it. And as she stood in the center of the garden, surrounded by family, friends, and memories of the life she had built, she made a silent vow. The time for silence was ending. Soon the truth would be spoken, and when it was, neither Richard nor Margaret would escape its weight. The night had reached its peak. Guests swirled across the dance floor, their laughter echoing under the string of lanterns, glasses raised high with the last of the champagne. Richard basked in the glow of admiration, telling jokes that made the men roar and the women chuckle. Margaret hovered nearby, her laughter ringing too loud, her smile stretched thin. To everyone else, the evening was a success. To Eleanor, it was theater, every moment a performance masking the rot beneath. She could feel her pulse in her temples, steady, insistent. The messages she had read on Richard's phone still burned in her memory, searing away every trace of doubt. Betrayal was no longer suspicion, it was fact, and Eleanor had never been a woman who swallowed truths to keep peace. Tonight had begun as a celebration of 30 years of marriage. It would end as the night she reclaimed her dignity. She rose from her seat, tapping her glass with a silver spoon. The ringing cut through the chatter, pulling every eye toward her. The music softened, conversation stilled, and Richard's smile faltered ever so slightly. He knew her too well not to sense the shift in her energy. Eleanor's voice was calm, steady, even warm at first. "I want to thank all of you," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, "for coming tonight to celebrate with us. 30 years is no small thing. It's years of laughter, of struggle, of raising children, of building a life together." Applause rippled softly. Richard nodded, smiling, as though this were another sentimental toast. "But 30 years," Eleanor continued, her tone sharpening just enough to draw focus, "is also 30 years of trust, of loyalty, of promises made in front of God, family, and friends. The silence deepened. Guests leaned in, sensing the weight of her words. Eleanor turned her gaze directly on Richard. And what is a marriage without loyalty? What is friendship without honesty? What is love without respect? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Richard's smile collapsed, his hand tightening around his glass. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, eyes darting toward the exit. Eleanor lifted her chin, her voice ringing out with clarity. Tonight, in front of all who matter most to us, I want to acknowledge the truth. That my husband of 30 years has been unfaithful, and that the woman he chose to betray me with is none other than my dearest friend, Margaret. The words fell like thunder. Gasps erupted, a glass shattered somewhere in the background, and silence followed, thick and suffocating. Margaret's face drained of color, her lips trembling as she struggled to speak. Richard shot to his feet, his voice booming in defense. "That's enough, Eleanor," he barked, his charm gone, replaced by panic. "This isn't the time or place." "Oh, it's exactly the time and place," Eleanor cut in, her voice firm, her presence commanding. "For years I have sacrificed for this marriage. I have given everything, my youth, my energy, my trust, and you repaid me with lies. Lies you carried on with my best friend, in secret, thinking I would never see." Margaret finally found her voice, stammering, "Eleanor, please, it's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "I read the messages, Margaret. I know where you've been. I know what you've done. Every word, every stolen moment. It's etched into my memory now. And you, of all people, the woman I called sister, betrayed me in the deepest way possible." The crowd sat frozen, stunned. Some shifted awkwardly, others whispered behind hands. The string quartet had stopped playing, their instruments silent in the tension. Richard's face had reddened, his fists clenched. "You're humiliating us," he muttered. "No," Eleanor said, her voice steel. "You humiliated me the moment you chose deceit. Tonight I reclaim my voice, my dignity. If anyone is ashamed, it should be you." For a long, breathless moment, the garden was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the night air. Then slowly, applause began. Hesitant at first, then building, as guests showed their quiet support for Eleanor's courage. Richard stood rigid, Margaret's face crumpled with tears. But Eleanor remained tall, her glass raised not in celebration this time, but in defiance. "To loyalty," she said softly, almost to herself, though every guest heard. "To the loyalty I gave and never received. To the loyalty I will demand of myself from this day forward." And with that, she drank, her dignity shining brighter than any lantern that lit the garden. The party dissolved in chaos. Guests whispered frantically, some slipping away quietly, others lingering out of morbid curiosity. The string quartet packed their instruments in silence, avoiding eye contact with anyone. What had begun as a celebration of love had ended in a public reckoning, and the weight of Eleanor's revelation still lingered in the heavy night air. Richard stood stiffly near the head table, jaw clenched, his once confident shoulders sagging beneath the burden of exposure. His eyes darted between guests as though searching for an ally, but none dared to meet his gaze. Margaret sat crumpled in her chair, her once perfect emerald gown now wrinkled and stained by the tears streaming down her cheeks. She clutched at her napkin, shredded from her nervous fidgeting, her hands trembling with shame. Eleanor, however, remained composed. She had shed her illusions, and with them, the need to hide her pain. Her dignity wrapped around her like armor, protecting her from the humiliation that might have crushed another woman. She stood among the wreckage of trust and loyalty, steady as stone, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. Her daughter approached first, eyes wide with shock, her voice low and trembling. "Mom, is it true?" "All of it." Eleanor took her daughter's hand, squeezing it firmly. "Yes," she whispered, her voice calm but raw. "But the truth, as ugly as it is better than a lie." Her daughter's eyes filled with tears, and she embraced her mother fiercely, whispering promises of support. Her son, too, hovered close, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. How could he? He muttered under his breath, glaring at Richard across the lawn. Eleanor squeezed his shoulder gently. Because some men forget the worth of what they already have. The guests began to leave in clusters, murmuring their goodbyes with awkward sympathy. Some hugged Eleanor tightly, offering whispered encouragement. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the rawness of what they had witnessed. By the time the last of them had gone, only Richard, Margaret, and Eleanor remained beneath the flickering lanterns. Richard finally spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. Eleanor, you didn't have to do that. Not like this. We could have handled this privately. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes sharp. You handled it privately for months. You handled it in lies, in secrecy, and betrayal. Tonight the truth came into the light, and that's where it belongs. Margaret rose shakily to her feet, her face streaked with mascara. Eleanor, I never meant... Don't! Eleanor cut her off, her voice cold. Don't insult me with apologies you don't mean. You sat at my table, you held my children, you called me sister, and all the while you took what was mine. You meant every word, every touch, every betrayal. So don't stand there and pretend it was anything less. Margaret's shoulders crumpled, and without another word, she fled into the night, her heels clicking against the stone path until the sound faded. Richard remained, his expression a mixture of shame and defiance. It was a mistake, he said, his tone desperate. I lost my way. But we can fix this, Eleanor. We can move past it. Eleanor stared at him, the man she had loved for 3 decades, the man she had built her life beside. Once, his words might have soothed her, convinced her to forgive. But now, after seeing the truth laid bare, there was no going back. You broke something that cannot be repaired, she said quietly. You didn't just betray me, Richard. You betrayed everything we built, everything I gave. There is no moving past that, not for me. His face paled, the fight leaving his eyes. For the first time that night, Richard looked small. No longer the charming man admired by many, but a man stripped of his lies, exposed for what he truly was. Eleanor turned away, her body trembling not from weakness, but from release. The years of trust, the sacrifices, the love she had poured into her marriage, all of it had ended in this moment. Yet as painful as it was, she felt strangely free. The weight of suspicion and betrayal had lifted, replaced by the solid ground of truth. She stepped into the quiet house, her children following close behind, leaving Richard alone beneath the dying lanterns. The celebration was over. The illusion was shattered, but Eleanor's strength remained unbroken. The morning after the party, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, the soft light of dawn spilling across the garden, where lanterns still swayed from the night before. The remnants of celebration lingered, a half-empty champagne glass on the table, petals scattered on the grass. But the air felt different now, lighter, clearer. She sipped her coffee slowly, the bitterness grounding her. For the first time in years, she felt no need to check where Richard was, no urge to plan her day around someone else's needs. He had slept in the guest room, silent and sullen, while Margaret had disappeared altogether. Their absence no longer weighed on Eleanor. In fact, it lifted her. Her daughter appeared in the doorway, offering a tentative smile. Are you all right, Mom? Eleanor nodded. I'm more than all right. I'm free. The words surprised even her, but as soon as she spoke them, she knew they were true. She had carried a marriage for 30 years, poured her energy into keeping it alive, and trusted friendships that did not deserve her loyalty. That chapter was closed now. Painful, yes, but behind it waited something she hadn't felt in decades. Possibility. Later that day, Eleanor dug out an old box from the attic, filled with things she had once loved but had set aside. Brushes from her painting days, journals she hadn't written in since her children were young, a stack of travel brochures she had once collected. Holding them again, she felt the stirrings of a self she had nearly forgotten. The woman she was before betrayal, before compromise turned into sacrifice. She wasn't naive. Healing would take time. Nights would come when loneliness pressed hard, when memories threatened to drown her. But Eleanor had faced storms before, and each one had made her stronger. This would be no different. As the sun climbed higher, she stepped out into the garden. She breathed deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs, her heart steady. This space no longer felt like a battlefield. It was hers again, her sanctuary, her beginning. Eleanor lifted her chin toward the sky, her eyes clear and unflinching. To loyalty, she whispered once more. But this time, the vow was to herself. And with that, she walked forward, not as a betrayed wife, not as a broken friend, but as a woman reborn, ready to claim the life that was always hers.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.